The Forgotten Princess, the untold story of Princess Alice of Battenberg. In the grand halls of Windsor Castle, where destiny breathes through marble walls and royal portraits whisper stories of old, a baby girl was born. Her name, was Alice. The year was 1885, and she was no ordinary child. Born in Windsor Castle, Princess Alice of Battenberg came into the world as a great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, and niece to Europe's most powerful monarchs. Her lineage sparkled with crowns and titles, but hidden behind the diamonds and silk lay a truth that no one could see. Because the little princess was deaf. A silent childhood. Even as a baby, Alice barely reacted to sound. When the nursery bells chimed or the maids whispered lullabies, her eyes would stay still, lost in her own quiet world. Doctors examined her. The diagnosis was harsh: severe congenital deafness. But this wasn't a child who would fade into silence. Alice learned to read lips, not just in one language, but in multiple. English, German, French. She mastered them all through observation and willpower. Her mother, Princess Victoria of Hesse, refused to let her daughter live in isolation. She brought tutors, trained teachers, and even speech specialists to help Alice. And slowly, the young princess began to speak. Her voice was soft, broken, but determined. "If I cannot hear the world," as she once wrote, "then I shall learn to see it more clearly than anyone else." Rose the beauty of Battenberg. As Alice grew older, the European royal circles began to take notice of her grace. She was elegant, tall, and beautiful, with soft grey eyes and a quiet charm that drew people in. By her teenage years, she was considered one of the most eligible princesses in Europe. But Alice wasn't chasing grandeur. She was searching for meaning. And that meaning came in the form of a handsome naval officer, Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark. They met at a royal gathering, her cousin's wedding, to be exact, and something unspoken passed between them. Andrew was dashing, confident, and playful, and Alice, despite her shyness, had a glow that drew him close. Within a year, they were engaged. A union of hearts and empires, and newspapers declared. A match made in heaven, whispered the guests. But heaven, as fate would show, had other plans: a royal wedding and a fragile dream. The wedding took place in Darmstadt in 1903, a grand affair filled with royal guests from every corner of Europe. Kings, queens, dukes, all gathered to witness the beautiful deaf princess marry the charming prince. As the bells rang and confetti filled the air, no one could imagine that this radiant couple would one day lose everything: their titles, their home, their sanity. Alice became Princess Andrew of Greece and Denmark, and soon, the couple had children, 4 daughters and a son, Philip. Yes, that Philip, the man who would later marry Queen Elizabeth II and become the Duke of Edinburgh. But back then, they were just a family of 6, trying to find peace in a world that was crumbling, the fall of a kingdom. By the 1920s, the Greek monarchy was falling apart. Political chaos tore through the nation, and revolutions were on the streets. Prince Andrew's military campaign ended in disaster, and the royal family became the target of public anger. One night, in the middle of the chaos, soldiers stormed their residence. Prince Andrew was arrested, charged with treason. Alice, terrified but composed, held her children close. Through secret arrangements and help from British diplomats, the family managed to escape aboard a British warship, the HMS Calypso. Imagine that scene. Yoni, the royal family, stripped of all luxury, fleeing their homeland with just a few bags and crying children. Alice carried baby Philip in a fruit box, the only thing she could. That box, Philip would later say, "It was my first crib." Exile and struggle. The family settled in Paris, but life in exile wasn't royal anymore. They lived in a small apartment given by Alice's aunt, far from the palaces and privileges they once knew. Andrew drifted into despair, gambling and spending time away. Alice, on the other hand, turned to religion, praying for peace, praying for direction. But inside her, something began to crack. She started hearing voices, claiming she could communicate with saints. She believed she had a divine mission. The stress, trauma, and loneliness finally caught up with her mind. Doctors were called. In 1930, at the age of just 45, Princess Alice was diagnosed with schizophrenia. She was taken away, forcibly, to a mental institution in Switzerland. Her husband distanced himself. Her children were scattered across Europe. And her young son, Philip, was sent to live with relatives in England, completely unaware of what had become of his mother, the woman they forgot. For the next several years, Princess Alice lived in near isolation. Psychiatrists tried to cure her with harsh methods. Even Sigmund Freud was consulted, who cruelly suggested a radiation therapy to suppress her emotions. But Alice didn't lose faith. She read the Bible every day, wrote letters, and prayed endlessly. In her letters, she spoke of seeing angels and feeling divine purpose. Everyone thought she was lost forever. But inside her, something sacred was awakening. The return of light. By the mid-1930s, Alice slowly began to recover. Against all odds, she walked out of the institution, quiet, thin, but glowing with an inner peace that no one could explain. She returned to Greece, alone, to a country still in turmoil. The monarchy had been restored temporarily, and she took a small apartment in Athens. There, she lived simply, wearing grey nun-like clothes, helping the poor, feeding the hungry, visiting the sick. No longer a princess of palaces, but a princess of faith. God had taken away everything, as she once said, so that I could learn what truly matters. This was no longer the Alice of Windsor, nor the Alice of Battenberg. She had transformed into something greater, a woman who had lost everything, yet found peace in giving. But her journey was far from over. Because soon, the world would once again descend into darkness, and this time, the forgotten princess would become a savior, once a princess in marble halls. Now a lonely woman. In a war-torn land, this is the return of Princess Alice. A war rekindled. It was 1939. Europe trembled once again under the boots of war. Nations fell. Families scattered. And the shadow of Nazi Germany crept across the continent. Alice, now in her 50s, lived in Athens, alone, widowed in spirit, forgotten by her family, and stripped of her royal title. But instead of fleeing to safety like many royals did, Alice made a decision that would define her legacy. I will not leave Greece. My place is with the people who suffer. And so, while bombs fell and soldiers marched through the streets, this once silenced princess became a beacon of compassion in a world that had lost its humanity, the woman in grey. By now, Alice had become deeply religious. She dressed simply, a grey habit, resembling a nun's robe. Her face carried the calm of a saint, yet behind her eyes burned the pain of decades of struggle. Every morning, she walked through Athens carrying food for the poor. Every night, she prayed by candlelight for peace. The people began to call her the Lady in Grey. But even they didn't know the full story, the depth of her courage that was about to unfold. The occupation of Greece. When the Nazis occupied Greece, the situation turned horrifying. Starvation spread. Jewish families were hunted. The city that once sang hymns now echoed with the screams of fear. And right in the middle of it all stood Princess Alice. She opened her modest home to the hungry, the sick, and the terrified. She sold her jewelry to buy medicine. And when she had nothing left to give, she gave faith. "We are never poor," as she told a nurse once, "ere as long as we have something to share." But her greatest act of courage was still to come, the secret guest. One cold night in 1943, a man came knocking on her door. He was desperate, trembling, and carrying a secret heavier than gold. His name was Chaim Cohen, a Jewish man whose wife Rachel and 2 children were being hunted by the Gestapo. He begged her for help. Any other person would have shut the door, out of fear, out of instinct. But not Alice. She took them in, all 4 of them, and hid them inside her home for months. She gave them food, warmth, and hope. "You are safe here," as she told them softly. "No one will harm you under my roof." When Nazi officers came to search her house, she stood tall, fearless. They interrogated her, but she pretended she couldn't hear their questions. And indeed, she couldn't. She was deaf. Her lifelong disability became her shield. Every question from the Gestapo went unanswered. Every threat met only silence. The soldiers left, frustrated. And the Cohen family lived, because of her courage, faith in the fire. The war dragged on. Athens starved. Death lingered like smoke. But Alice never stopped. She organized soup kitchens, cared for orphans, and prayed with the dying. People would sometimes whisper, "Is she mad, or is she holy?" The truth was, she was both. Her past struggles with mental illness had carved a kind of divine empathy into her soul. She understood suffering, not from books or sermons, but from living through it. And in those broken streets, she found purpose. "We cannot cure madness with cruelty," as she once said. "Only love has the power to restore a soul." Sunrise, the liberation. In 1944, the war finally ended in Greece. When the Allied forces arrived, they found a country broken, and a woman who had become its silent guardian. Alice was exhausted, weak, and nearly penniless. But her spirit glowed brighter than ever. Her name spread quietly among the survivors. The Jewish family she saved told everyone about the royal nun who had hidden them from death. When they asked her why she did it, she smiled and said, "I did what I believed was right. That is all." No medals. No recognition. No glory. Just a deep, humble peace. Crown the forgotten mother. Meanwhile, in another part of Europe, her son Philip had grown into a man. A naval officer, handsome, disciplined, and deeply loyal to the crown. He was courting a young princess named Elizabeth. Yes, that Elizabeth, the future Queen of England. But Philip's mother, Alice, wasn't there for the royal wedding. She wasn't invited to the early celebrations. In the grand tapestry of the British monarchy, she was a quiet shadow, a name seldom mentioned. Because the royal world didn't know what to do with her, a princess who had lived in exile, suffered mental illness, and now dressed like a nun. But destiny has a strange way of circling back. Love letter, a letter from a son. Years later, as Philip became the Duke of Edinburgh, he reached out to his mother. Their relationship had been distant, not out of anger, but because of the chaos that had separated them. He wrote her a letter. "I often think of you. The world may not understand you, but I do. You have lived through storms I cannot imagine." Alice, reading those words in her small Athens apartment, smiled softly. The boy she had once carried in a fruit box was now a prince of Britain. And she, the forgotten princess, was proud, not of the crown, but of the character she had passed on. Sunrise over mountains, the calling. After the war, Alice didn't retire into luxury. Instead, she founded a religious order, the Christian Sisterhood of Martha and Mary, a group of nuns dedicated to nursing the sick and helping the poor. She lived in a tiny room, slept on a hard bed, and owned almost nothing. Yet, her heart overflowed with peace. When reporters asked her why she lived like this, she replied simply, "Because I have seen what happens when man forgets to love. A soul at peace." For decades, she continued her quiet work in Greece, visiting hospitals, praying with widows, comforting the broken. And though the world often ignored her, those who met her never forgot her presence, calm, dignified, luminous. She had gone from a royal ballroom to a war shelter, from a throne or to the streets, from madness to sainthood. Her life was a journey through suffering, yet every wound she bore became a light for someone else. She was a woman who turned pain into purpose, one survivor said. A saint who wore no crown. In a time when empires collapsed and kings fell, one woman stood, not as a ruler, but as a redeemer. She had faced war, madness, and exile, and yet her heart never turned bitter. This was Princess Alice, the mother who raised a prince, the nun who defied Nazis, the saint who lived in silence, and the forgotten royal who found the sound of her soul, or in faith. Some lives shine not through power, but through quiet grace. Hers was one of them. A Princess Returns. It was the late 1940s. Europe was healing, rebuilding from the ashes of war. Kings and queens regained their thrones, but Alice, the once lost princess, remained in her humble home in Athens, living as a nun, far from royal palaces or luxury. And then, one day, a letter arrived. It was from her son, Prince Philip, now the husband of Queen Elizabeth II. Britain had a new queen, and the world was watching her young reign begin. Philip invited his mother to come to London, to live with the royal family at Buckingham Palace. For a moment, Alice hesitated. Could she, after all these years of silence, step again into the palace of grandeur she once abandoned? But she accepted. Not for fame, but to be near her family. And so, in the autumn of 1967, a small, fragile woman in a simple grey habit stepped off the plane at Heathrow. No jewels, no crown, no guards, just a nun's cross around her neck and peace in her heart. The press watched in awe. The Queen's mother-in-law has arrived. One headline read, "A nun at the palace. The saint among royals." At Buckingham Palace, Alice was unlike anyone else. While others wore silken diamonds, she wore a plain grey habit. While the court spoke of politics and prestige, she spoke of God, kindness, and forgiveness. The Queen respected her deeply. Philip, though private, was comforted by her quiet presence. And the palace staff adored her simplicity. She spent her days quietly, reading scripture, smoking cigarettes in the garden. Yes, she did that, smiling face with open mouth and cold sweat, and writing letters to charities. Her laughter, though rare, had warmth, and her silence carried peace. To her, the palace was not a symbol of power, it was a place to serve. One does not need a throne to rule hearts, as she said once. Only compassion. Echoes of the past. But beneath her calm exterior, Alice carried the memories of everything she'd endured. The madness, the exile, the loneliness, the war. Sometimes, late at night, she would sit by her window, gazing out at the London rain, whispering prayers for those she'd once helped. She kept in touch with the Cohen family, the Jewish family she had hidden during the war. They called her their guardian angel. Years later, the State of Israel would honor her as one of the righteous among the nations, a rare title given to those who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. But when they offered her recognition, she replied, "I did nothing special. We are all children of God." That humility, that quiet strength, made her unforgettable. Love letter, a mother's heart. Though life at the palace was comfortable, Alice continued to live with the discipline of a nun. She gave away what little she had, refused special treatment, and often disappeared into chapels for hours of silent prayer. Philip, ever the stoic prince, didn't always show emotion. But deep down, he carried immense respect and gratitude for his mother. During a private conversation, a close aide once overheard him say, "She's been through hell and came out a saint." And truly, she had. Sunrise over mountains, the final dawn. By 1969, Princess Alice's health began to decline. Her once bright eyes grew dim, and her steps slower. But her faith, it never wavered. In December of that year, as Christmas lights glimmered in London, the quiet princess took her final breath at Buckingham Palace, at the age of 84. No royal fanfare. No grand ceremony. Just a silent passing, peaceful and serene. Her final wish? To be buried not in England, but in Jerusalem, the holy city she had always longed for. Years later, in 1988, her remains were moved there, fulfilling her wish. She now rests in the Church of Mary Magdalene, overlooking the Mount of Olives, side by side with saints. Her everlasting legacy. Today, few remember her name compared to the monarchs she lived among. But those who know her story never forget her light. She wasn't just a princess. She was a woman who faced silence and found her voice through kindness, who lost her mind and found her soul in faith, who lived in war and became a refuge for the lost. Her life, as said one historian, was a sermon written not in words, but in deeds. Even the late Queen Elizabeth, in private reflection, once called her a woman of rare courage and grace. And Prince Philip, her son, carried her memory until his final days. At his funeral in 2021, His coffin carried something deeply personal, the cross of Princess Alice placed on top. A silent tribute to the mother who had given him strength, even from the shadows. Sun with small cloud hashed the moral of a life. In a world obsessed with crowns, fame, and fortune, Princess Alice stood apart. She proved that true royalty isn't about titles or jewels. It's about the heart. She taught us that faith is not blind, it is seeing light through darkness. That love doesn't need an audience, it needs courage. And that sometimes, the loudest voices come from those who live in silence. She lived like a princess. She suffered like a saint. And she died, or at peace. This was the story of Princess Alice of Battenberg, the deaf princess who heard the cries of the world, the forgotten mother who became a symbol of compassion, the woman who found her kingdom, not in palaces, but in people's hearts, the saint in the palace, the light that never fades.